The containment field hummed a cold blue as they dragged him through the corridors of the Velith expanse, and every alien in the station stopped what they were doing to stare at the creature inside. Commander Elias Voss did not look at them. He kept his eyes forward, his wrists locked in magnetic cuffs that pulsed with every heartbeat, and his torn uniform hung from his shoulders like the skin of a dead animal. They had taken him 6 days ago when his corvette was ambushed near the border of contested space, and the crew he had sworn to protect were either dead or scattered across the void in escape pods he prayed had made it somewhere safe. Now he belonged to someone. The station was enormous, a spinning city of metal and light built into the skeleton of a hollowed asteroid, and it smelled like ozone and something sweet that made his stomach turn. Thousands of species moved through its corridors in rivers of color and noise, and they parted like water when the guards brought him through. He heard whispers in languages his translator chip could barely keep up with. Is that really one of them? A human. I heard they eat living creatures. I heard they cook flesh over open fire and consume it with their bare hands. Look at its teeth. A child, or what passed for a child among the tall insectoid vreth, pressed against its parent and let out a high whine of terror. Elia said nothing. He had not spoken a single word since they captured him, and he did not plan to start now. The guards were Korath, broad-shouldered reptilians with skin like cracked volcanic rock and 6 narrow eyes that glowed faintly amber in the dim light. They held energy lances at their sides and walked with the casual confidence of beings who had never been seriously challenged in their own territory. They brought him to the lower levels of the station where the lights were red and the air was thicker, and the sounds changed from the chatter of commerce to something older and uglier. He heard animals crying behind walls. He heard chains. He heard silence in the places where silence should not exist, and he understood exactly what kind of place this was. They put him in a cage. It was not a cell or a room or quarters. It was a cage, transparent on all sides, sitting in a long row of other cages that held creatures from worlds he had never heard of. Some of them were enormous, pressing against their barriers with dull eyes. Some were small and trembling. One cage was empty and still smelled like death. A tall figure appeared on the other side of the transparent wall, and 6 eyes studied Elias the way a collector studies a new piece of art. This was Syndicate Master Rael Torvan. He wore robes of deep violet that moved like liquid, and his cracked obsidian skin was decorated with thin lines of bioluminescent ink that pulsed in slow patterns. He was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful, and when he smiled his mouth opened wider than any human mouth could. So this is a human, Rael said, and his voice was smooth and rich like something poured from a bottle. Elias looked at him and said nothing. Rael tilted his head, and 2 of his 6 eyes narrowed while the others stayed wide. I paid more for you than I have paid for anything in my collection, he said, and I must say you are smaller than I expected. Elias sat down on the floor of the cage and crossed his legs. They told me your kind are predators, Rael continued, circling the cage with slow steps, that you chase your prey across open ground until it collapses from exhaustion, that you break the bones of animals and suck the marrow, that you burn their flesh and call it celebration. He stopped and pressed one long finger against the transparent wall. In 7 cycles I am going to hold an event, he said, and you are going to eat in front of my guests, and they are going to watch what a real predator looks like, and it is going to be the most talked about spectacle this sector has seen in 100 years. He waited for a response. Elias gave him nothing. Rael eventually left, and the guards took their positions at the ends of the corridor, and the red lights dimmed to something that was supposed to pass for night. Elias sat in the dark and listened. He counted the guards' footsteps as they walked their patrol, and he found that they followed the same path every time with the same number of steps between each turn. He watched the locking mechanism on his cage when they came to check on him, and he noted that it was a 3-stage magnetic release operated by a control panel 12 steps to the left of his cage. He studied the ceiling and found maintenance hatches every 40 meters. He tracked the vibration in the floor and determined that the power relays ran beneath the corridor in a pattern that moved east to west. He did all of this without moving from his seated position, and anyone watching would have thought he was simply staring at nothing. On the second night, a small figure appeared outside his cage. She was barely a meter tall, covered in soft gray feathers that were matted and dirty, and she had enormous dark eyes that reflected the red emergency lights like pools of oil. She carried a cleaning tool in one hand and a bucket in the other, and she moved between the cages with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this work since before she could remember. Her name was Yinri, and she was Aelith, and she was a slave. She cleaned around Elia's cage without looking at him, but he could see her hands trembling, and when she accidentally made eye contact, she flinched so hard she nearly dropped her bucket. He remained still. She came back the next night and the night after that, and each time she was a little less afraid, not because he had done anything to earn her trust, but because he had done nothing to justify her fear. On the fourth night, she stopped outside his cage and stood there for a long time. "They are bringing something for you to kill," she said in a whisper so faint his translator almost missed it. "Something with claws, and they want you to eat it while it is still moving, and the tickets have already sold out across 3 systems." Elias looked at her. It was the first time he had looked directly at anyone since his capture, and Yinri felt the weight of that gaze like a hand pressing on her chest. His eyes were not wild or savage or filled with the predatory hunger the stories described. They were calm. They were patient. They were the eyes of someone who was not waiting to be rescued, but was building something inside his mind, piece by piece, with the patience of a creature whose ancestors once tracked wounded animals across entire continents for days without stopping. "They are going to make you kill something," she said again, and there was pity in her voice. The human opened his mouth, and his voice came out rough and low like stones grinding together, and the translator Chip rendered his words in clean galactic common. "No," he said, "they are going to regret giving me the chance." Yinri stared at him. She had cleaned these cages for years, and she had seen every kind of creature pass through them, and she had watched them all break eventually, because that is what cages do to living things. But this one was not breaking. She could see it now in the way he sat, and the way his eyes moved, and the way his hands rested open on his knees, as if he had already decided what they were going to do, and was simply waiting for the right moment to do it. She did not understand humans. She did not know what they were capable of. But standing there in the red dark of the lower levels with the cries of caged animals echoing through the metal walls, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like maybe the cage was not going to hold. Dr. Salith Moan had studied over 300 species in her career and had never once lost sleep over any of them. Until the human. She was Fellini, tall and thin with translucent blue skin through which the faint glow of her bioluminescent veins was always visible, and she had been hired by Rail to conduct a full biological profile on his new acquisition before the event. It was supposed to be routine. She brought her scanning equipment to the cage on the first morning and expected the creature to resist or panic, or at least show some sign of distress, the way most captive species did when confronted with unfamiliar technology. Instead, the human stood up, walked to the edge of the cage, and held out his arm as if he had done this 1,000 times before. She pressed the bioscanner to his skin, and the readings began to fill her display, and within the first 60 seconds she felt something cold settle in her stomach. His bone density was extraordinary. thick and reinforced in ways that suggested a world with punishing gravity, and a species that had evolved to absorb tremendous physical impact without shattering. His muscle fibers were a type she had only seen in long-distance migration species, built not for explosive power, but for sustained effort over impossible durations. His cardiovascular system was a machine designed for one purpose, and that purpose was to never stop moving. She ran the scan again, because she thought the equipment must be malfunctioning. It was not. She took the results back to her laboratory and began cross-referencing them with every predator species in the galactic database, and the more she compared, the more uneasy she became. Most predators in the galaxy were ambush hunters, built for short explosive attacks that either succeeded immediately or failed entirely. The human was not built like that at all. The human was built to follow, to drag, to walk and jog and run at a moderate pace for hours and hours and hours, until whatever it was chasing simply could not run anymore and collapsed from exhaustion and overheating. And then the human would arrive, barely winded, and finish what it started. Persistence predation, her database called it, and it was one of the rarest and most terrifying hunting strategies ever recorded in any biosphere. She went back the next day and conducted cognitive tests. The human cooperated again, and she suspected he was cooperating not out of submission, but because he wanted to know what she was learning about him, as if he was studying her while she studied him. His pattern recognition scores were off the scale. She showed him sequences of symbols he had never seen before, and he identified the underlying logic within seconds. She showed him spatial puzzles designed for species with four-dimensional perception, and he solved them with only 3 dimensions available to him by finding workarounds she had never considered. His brain was not the largest she had ever scanned, and it was not the fastest, but it was the most adaptable. It rewired itself in real time, forming new connections and discarding old ones with a fluidity that made her equipment stutter trying to keep up. She compiled her report and brought it to Rael in his private chambers, where he sat surrounded by the trophies of 100 worlds, mounted on walls of polished black stone. "The human is more dangerous than you think," she said. Rael sipped from a crystal glass and did not look up. "It is one creature in a cage. It is a persistence predator with adaptive cognition and a stress response that does not degrade over time," she said, and she heard her own voice rising. "Most species under prolonged captivity show declining mental function, but his cognitive markers have actually improved since he was captured, which means confinement is not breaking him down, but is instead giving him time to process and plan." "Plan what?" Rael asked with mild amusement. "I do not know," she admitted, "and that is what frightens me." Rael waved a hand and told her the event would proceed as scheduled, and that she was welcome to watch from the observation deck if her nerves could handle it. She left his chambers and stood in the corridor for a long time with her hands pressed flat against the wall to stop them from shaking. 3 levels below, Elias was doing push-ups. He had started on the second day, and the guards had laughed at first because the movements looked absurd to them, a creature pressing itself against the ground over and over for no visible reason. By the 4th day they had stopped laughing because the human had not stopped. He did them in sets of 50 with controlled breathing between each set, and then he stretched every muscle in his body with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what his body could do and was making sure it was ready to do it. Between exercises, he sat perfectly still and watched. Yinri came every night, and by now she had stopped being afraid of him entirely, not because he was harmless, but because she had realized his danger was not pointed at her. On the 5th night, he began teaching her hand signals. Simple ones at first, a closed fist for stop, an open palm for go, 2 fingers for the number of guards in the corridor. She learned quickly, and he rewarded her with something she had not expected. He smiled, It was small and tired and did not reach his eyes, but it was real, and it was the first kindness anyone had shown her in longer than she could remember. "I need 3 things," he said quietly on the 6th night. "The guard rotation schedule for the upper levels, the location of the main power relays for the arena district, and where they are keeping the other human." "There is another human?" Yinri asked. "A man named Graves," Elias said. "I heard the guards talking about him on my 2nd day. They keep him somewhere in the Eastern Bloc and they use him for smaller shows." Yinri nodded and disappeared into the maintenance corridors. She knew better than anyone on the station, because no one ever paid attention to the slaves who cleaned the floors. She found Graves 2 nights later in a cell that smelled like old blood. He was thin and broken, with gaps in his teeth where they had been pulled and scars on his arms that told stories she did not want to hear. When she told him another human was here and that he was planning something, Graves shook his head. "Tell him not to fight," Graves whispered. "Tell him they always win. Tell him I tried once and this is what happened." He held up his hands, and she saw that 2 of his fingers were missing. Yinri brought the message back to Elias, and she watched his face change when she described what had been done to Graves. It was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more frightening than anger. It was the look of a man updating a list inside his head, adding new names and new reasons to a calculation that had been running since the moment the cage door closed behind him. "Did you find the power relays?" he asked. She told him what she had found, and he closed his eyes and she could almost see the map building itself behind his eyelids, corridors and junctions and access points clicking into place like pieces of a machine. "And the guard rotation." She gave him the times and the numbers and the patterns she had observed, and he nodded once. "Good," he said. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "Tomorrow they are going to put me in an arena and expect me to be an animal," he said, "and I am going to show them what happens when you mistake a human for something simple." On the final night before the event, Dr. Salith came to the cage one last time. She stood on the other side of the transparent wall and studied him with her large luminous eyes, and he studied her right back. "Do you understand what is going to happen tomorrow?" she asked in a professional tone that almost hid the tremor underneath. Elias stood and walked to the wall and stood so close that his breath left fog on the surface. "You studied what humans are," he said, and his voice was quiet and even, "but you did not study what humans do when they are cornered." She stared at him and he stared back, and for a moment the cage felt like it was on the wrong side of the wall. Dr. Salith turned and walked away, and she did not look back because she was afraid that if she did she would see something in his eyes that would make her run, not away from the cage, but away from the station entirely. Her hands did not stop shaking for the rest of the night. The arena was a cathedral of cruelty built in a perfect circle at the heart of the station, with seats rising in tiers that reached so high, the upper rows disappeared into shadow and haze. 12,000 beings filled those seats on the night of the event, and holoscreens floating above the sand broadcast the spectacle to paying viewers across 3 star systems. The air smelled like sweat and spice, and the electric tang of excitement that comes when a crowd gathers to watch something suffer. Rael Torvund sat in his private box above the arena floor, surrounded by crystal glasses and silent attendants, and he looked down at the sand with the satisfied expression of a man whose investment was about to pay off in ways that money alone could not measure. The preliminary events had already warmed the crowd, lesser creatures set against one another in fights that were brutal and short, and exactly what the audience expected. But they were not here for that. They were here for the human. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena in 6 languages simultaneously, and the words painted a picture that made the crowd lean forward in their seats. Tonight they would witness the feeding of a genuine Terran predator, a creature from a death world where everything ate everything else, where the dominant species had clawed its way to supremacy by hunting and consuming the flesh of other living beings. Tonight they would see the monster behind the myth. The gates at the far end of the arena opened, and Elias Voss walked out onto the sand. They had removed his cuffs and dressed him in nothing but the torn remnants of his uniform, and under the harsh white lights of the arena, he looked exactly like what they wanted him to be. Small compared to most of the species watching. Soft-skinned and blunt-toothed, and standing on only 2 legs with no claws and no armor and no venom. The crowd murmured with a mixture of disappointment and fascination, because the stories had made humans sound like something vast and terrible, and this creature looked like it could be broken with one hand. Then a second gate opened on the opposite side of the arena. The Velthari came out fast. It was a predator from a jungle world, built low to the ground with 4 powerful legs, and a body covered in overlapping scales the color of dried blood. Its head was wide and flat with a jaw that could crush stone, and its eyes were yellow and empty, and locked onto the only moving thing in the arena. Elias did not run. He did not scream or panic or freeze the way the crowd expected. He turned to face the animal, and he took one slow breath, and then he began to move. Not toward it and not away from it, but sideways, circling at a steady walk with his eyes fixed on the Velthari's body. The animal tracked him, turning its head, its muscles coiling under those dark scales. The crowd was confused. Where was the savagery? Where was the predator they had been promised? Why was the human just walking in circles like a broken machine? The Velthari charged. It covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, jaws open, claws tearing grooves in the sand, and the crowd surged to their feet because this was the moment they had paid for. Elias stepped to the side. It was not a dramatic leap or a desperate dive, but a single precise step that put him exactly outside the arc of the animal's jaws. And as the Velthari's momentum carried it past him, he reached out and slapped the side of its head with an open palm. The animal skidded to a stop and turned, confused and enraged. It charged again. Elias sidestepped again, the same calm motion, the same controlled distance, and this time he watched the way its legs moved and the way it distributed its weight on the turns. The third charge came faster and from a different angle, and Elias adjusted without thinking because his brain was doing what human brains had done for 200,000 years, reading patterns, predicting movement, building a model of the threat and updating it in real time. By the fourth charge, he had identified the Velthari's blind spot on its lower left side, where the overlapping scales created a gap in its peripheral vision. By the fifth, he had measured its fatigue threshold and knew it could sustain maximum effort for roughly 90 seconds before its breathing became labored. By the sixth, he had found what he was looking for. The animal charged one final time, and Elias did not step aside. He stepped forward. The crowd gasped as he moved inside the arc of those crushing jaws and wrapped his arms around the Velthari's neck in a hold that used leverage instead of strength. And he twisted his body and used the animal's own weight to drag it off balance. The Velthari thrashed, and its claws raked across his ribs and drew blood that ran hot and red down his side. But he did not let go. He squeezed and shifted and applied pressure to the points where the animal's neck met its skull, and slowly, agonizingly, the thrashing weakened. The Velthari's legs buckled. It went down onto the sand with a heavy thud, and Elias went down with it, holding the animal pinned against his body with his arms locked, and his legs braced, and his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. The arena went silent. 12,000 beings watched as the human held the predator down without killing it, without tearing into it, without doing any of the terrible things they had been told humans do. The Velthari stopped struggling. It lay on the sand, breathing hard, alive, and subdued by something it could not understand. Elias released it and stood up. He was bleeding from the claw marks on his ribs, and his arms were shaking from the effort, and sand was stuck to the blood on his skin. He did not look at the animal. He turned his back on it and faced the crowd, and there was a moment of absolute stillness in which 12,000 beings understood that something had gone wrong with the script. Then he raised one hand and pointed directly at Rael Torvan's private box. He did not speak. He did not need to. The gesture said everything. You are not the audience. You are not in control. You are what I am hunting. Rael stood up from his seat, and for the first time in his life, the Syndicate Master felt something he had only ever seen in the eyes of the creatures in his cages. He felt prey. Then the lights went out. The arena plunged into darkness so complete that the screams started immediately, not from pain, but from the primal terror of 12,000 beings suddenly unable to see in a place where a predator was loose. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, painting everything in a deep red glow that made the arena look like the inside of a wound. The holoscreens flickered and died. The containment fields on the lower levels, the cages where Elias had spent his weeks of silent observation, shuddered and failed one by one as the power relays overloaded in exactly the sequence that a small feathered slave had triggered at exactly the time she had been told. Yinri had done her part. She had followed the map he had drawn for her in hand signals and whispered words. Crawling through maintenance shafts, she had traveled 1,000 times but never with purpose until now, and she had found the relay junction he described, and she had pulled the 3 cables he specified in the order he specified, and the station had gone dark like a candle blown out by a breath. In the arena, the crowd was stamping toward the exits, and the guards were shouting orders that no one could hear over the chaos. Below the arena floor, cage doors were opening. Creatures that had been imprisoned for months and years stumbled into corridors they had never seen, blinking in the red emergency light, and the sound of their collective freedom was a roar that shook the metal walls. Elias moved through the chaos like water through cracks, silent and fast, and heading not for the exits but deeper into the station, toward the communication hub he had identified on his 3rd day of captivity. He reached it in 4 minutes. The room was unmanned because every guard on the station was running toward the arena. He sat down at the console, and his fingers moved across the controls with the ease of a man who had spent weeks watching guards operate identical panels through the transparent walls of his cage. He opened a channel. Every speaker on the station, every holoscreen, every personal communicator within range crackled to life with a single voice. Calm and clear and speaking in Galactic Common, with an accent that none of them had ever heard before. My name is Commander Elias Voss, United Earth Marine Corps. The station froze. In the corridors and the arena and the private boxes and the guard stations, every being on the Velith expanse heard the next words, and understood that the night was not a malfunction or an accident, but a plan that had been running long before any of them realized the cage was not holding what they thought it was holding. You wanted to see what a human does to flesh, the voice said, and there was no anger in it and no fear and no mercy. Pay attention. The Velith expanse had been designed to keep things inside. Every corridor was a funnel, every junction a choke point, every bulkhead a gate that could slam shut and seal a section airtight in under 3 seconds. It was a masterpiece of containment architecture, built by slavers who understood that the most important feature of any cage was that the thing inside it could never feel like it had a way out. Elias Voss had spent 3 weeks memorizing that architecture from the inside, and now he was using it like a weapon. He moved through the maintenance corridors at a steady jog, not sprinting because sprinting was wasteful, and wasteful was something humans had evolved past 100,000 years ago on a hot savanna where the ones who sprinted died and the ones who paced themselves ate. The emergency lighting turned every hallway into a tunnel of red shadow, and the alarms had created a wall of noise that covered his footsteps and masked his breathing. He reached the eastern block in 11 minutes. Graves was still in his cell, sitting in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees and his broken hands trembling. And when the door slid open, he looked up with the hollow eyes of a man who had stopped believing that doors could open in his favor. Elias crouched in front of him. "My name is Voss," he said. "I am a commander in the United Earth Marine Corps, and I am getting you out of here." Graves stared at him like he was looking at a ghost. "They will kill you," he whispered. "They will try," Elias said, and he helped Graves to his feet and put the man's arm over his shoulder because Graves could barely walk and Elias could carry him if he had to. They moved through the corridors together, and as they moved, the station transformed around them from a prison into a battlefield. The Syndicate's security forces had mobilized. Over 200 Korath soldiers in full armor with energy weapons and tactical training that had been more than enough to control every slave revolt and prisoner escape the station had ever seen. They were not prepared for this. The first squad found Elias in Corridor 7 of the Eastern Block. There were 6 of them, armored and armed and moving in a standard sweep formation, and when they saw the human carrying another human through the red-lit hallway, they raised their weapons and barked commands in Korath battle language. Elias set Graves down gently behind a support pillar and turned to face them. He did not have a weapon. He had a fire suppression canister he had pulled from the wall 3 corridors back. He triggered it, and a cloud of white chemical foam exploded into the hallway, blinding the squad for exactly 4 seconds, and 4 seconds was all he needed. He moved through the foam like something born in it, and when it cleared, 2 guards were unconscious, and a third was missing his weapon, which was now in Elias' hands. The remaining 3 fired, and their shots hit the walls where he had been standing half a second earlier, because he had already calculated their firing angles from the way they held their weapons, and had moved before they pulled the triggers. He disabled them with their own weapon set to its lowest power mode, because killing was noisy, and noise attracted reinforcements, and reinforcements were not part of the plan. Not yet. He armed Graves with one of the fallen guard's sidearms, and the man held it with shaking hands but held it nonetheless, and something in his hollow eyes flickered back to life like an ember that had been waiting for air. They moved deeper into the station, and word spread through the security channels that the human was loose and armed, and had already taken down a full squad without sustaining a single additional injury. The second engagement was the one that broke the Syndicate's confidence. A platoon of 12 soldiers cornered Elias in a long straight corridor with no side passages and no maintenance hatches, a perfect kill box that should have ended the situation immediately. Elias ran. He turned and ran in the opposite direction, and the platoon gave chase because their training told them that a fleeing enemy was a defeated enemy, and all they had to do was close the distance. They were faster than him in short bursts, their powerful reptilian legs eating up the corridor in massive strides, and for the first 30 seconds they gained ground rapidly. Then the corridor turned and split and turned again, and Elias kept running at the same steady pace he had maintained from the beginning, not fast but relentless, his breathing controlled and his stride unchanged. At the 2-minute mark, the fastest soldiers were still behind him, but their breathing was heavy. At the 5-minute mark, 3 of them had stopped, bent over with their hands on their knees and their lungs burning, because Korath physiology was built for power, not endurance. At the 10-minute mark, half the platoon had dropped out entirely. At the 20-minute mark, only 2 were still following, and they were staggering. At the 40-minute mark, Elias Voss stopped jogging, turned around, and walked back through the corridor past 12 soldiers who were scattered along its length like fallen trees after a storm, every one of them gasping and trembling, and completely unable to resist, as he calmly removed their weapons and their communication devices and left them sitting in the dark. He was barely breathing hard. This was persistence predation, the hunting strategy that had made humans the most successful predator their planet had ever produced. And it was not about being the fastest or the strongest or the most heavily armed. It was about being the one thing in the universe that simply never stopped coming. The freed prisoners began to find him after that. They came in ones and twos at first, creatures who had escaped their cages when the power failed and who had been wandering the corridors in confusion and terror until they heard the broadcast and followed the sound of someone who seemed to know where he was going. Elias organized them without hesitation. A group of amphibian Delwari were sent to the flooded lower maintenance decks where they could move freely, and the Korath could not. A cluster of insectoid Vreth were given the task of cutting communication lines in the walls, their small, precise limbs perfect for the delicate work of separating the right cables from the wrong ones. The herbivorous Talus, massive creatures with thick hides and gentle dispositions who had been kept as living displays, were positioned at corridor intersections as living barricades that the Korath soldiers could not move or intimidate. He spoke to each group calmly and clearly, and he learned their names, and he told them what they could do to help and why it mattered. And one by one they stopped being frightened prisoners and started being something else. A team. This was the other thing humans had carried out of their evolutionary history, the thing that made them more dangerous than any claw or venom or set of fangs. They could make anyone part of the pack. They could walk into a room full of strangers from different worlds who spoke different languages and had different bodies and different instincts, and within minutes they could find the common thread and weave it into something that functioned like a single organism. It was not dominance, it was not control, it was something the galactic databases did not have a word for but humans called leadership. And it was terrifying. Rael Torvan watched the security feeds from his command center as his station was systematically dismantled from the inside. And for the first time, the screens showed him something he could not buy or sell or cave. They showed him a human doing what humans do best. Adapting. Rael's hands found the self-destruct console. It was a failsafe built into every syndicate installation, a final option that ensured no enemy could ever capture the station intact. And when he activated the sequence, a countdown began on every screen in the command center. Dr. Salith stood beside him, and her translucent skin had gone pale as the bioluminescent veins beneath it dimmed with her rising dread. "You would kill everyone on the station," she said. "I would deny him his victory," Rael replied. The intercom crackled. "I already disabled your self-destruct 20 minutes ago," said the voice of Commander Elias Voss, with the calm patience of someone who had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. "That was the second thing I mapped." Rael's 6 eyes went wide. "Would you like to know what the first thing was?" Silence stretched through the command center like a wire being pulled tight. "The door to your room." Dr. Salith looked at Rael and Rael looked at the screens, and the screens showed him corridors full of freed prisoners, moving with coordination and purpose, toward the center of the station. Toward him. The countdown on the self-destruct console flickered and died, and the command center fell quiet except for the distant sound of footsteps growing louder. Growing closer. Never stopping. The door to Rael's command center did not open by force. It opened from the inside. Dr. Salith pressed her hand to the release panel and stepped back as the heavy blast doors slid apart with a sound like a long-held breath, finally being released. And she looked at the figure standing on the other side with an expression that was equal parts terror and relief. Elias Voss stood in the doorway. He was covered in grime and dried blood, most of it not his, and the claw marks on his ribs from the Velthari had been wrapped in strips torn from a guard's uniform. His hands were bruised and his knuckles were split, and there was a burn on his left shoulder, where an energy bolt had grazed him sometime in the last hour. He had been fighting and running and planning, and leading for 6 continuous hours without rest, without food, without a single moment where his mind had stopped calculating the next step. He should have been dead on his feet. Instead, he walked into the command center with the steady gait of a man, arriving at an appointment he had scheduled a long time ago. Rael's personal guards were waiting for him. There were 8 of them arranged in a semicircle around their master, and they were not ordinary soldiers, but Koreth elite, genetically enhanced warriors selected from birth for size and speed and aggression, encased in powered armor that amplified their already considerable strength by a factor of 4. Each one was carrying weapons that could cut through ship hulls. Elias was carrying nothing. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at them, and his eyes moved from one to the next with the same quiet attention he had given to the Velthari in the arena, reading their stances, measuring the distances between them, noting which ones shifted their weight to the left and which to the right, and which ones kept their weapons slightly too high. 2 seconds of observation. That was all he needed. The first guard attacked with a sweeping strike that should have taken his head from his shoulders, and Elias dropped beneath it and came up inside the guard's reach, where the long weapon was useless, and he drove his palm into the gap between the helmet and the chest plate with a precision that spoke of 20 years of training in the art of finding the places where armor does not cover. The guard went down. The second and third came together, and Elias moved between them like water through a gap in stones, redirecting the second guard's strike into the third, and using the collision to create the half-second opening. He needed to disable both of them with their own momentum. The fourth guard fired his weapon, and the energy bolt hit the console behind where Elias had been standing a fraction of a second before because Elias had read the guard's trigger hand and moved before the shot was released. He closed the distance in 3 steps and took the weapon away with a joint lock that bent the guard's arm in a direction it was not designed to go, and the guard screamed and fell, and Elias was already turning toward the 5th. It was not a fight. It was a lesson. Every movement was economy, no wasted energy, no dramatic flourishes, no rage. Just a man who had been trained by the most relentless military institution his species had ever produced, doing the thing he had been trained to do with the calm focus of a craftsman at his workbench. The 6th guard hesitated, and hesitation is death in combat, and he was on the floor before he understood what had happened. The 7th threw down his weapon and raised his hands because he had watched 6 of his brothers fall in under a minute, and his enhanced genetics did not include an override for the survival instinct that was now screaming at him to stop fighting the thing that could not be beat. The 8th never moved at all. Elias stood in the center of the room with 8 elite warriors on the floor around him, and he was breathing hard now, finally, his body showing the cost of everything he had done since the lights went out. But his eyes were clear. He turned to Rael. The syndicate master had not moved from his seat, and his 6 eyes were wide, and the bioluminescent patterns on his skin were flickering in random pulses that betrayed a level of fear his composed expression was trying very hard to hide. "What do you want?" Rael said, and his voice was steady but thin, like a wire about to snap. "Name your price, human. Everyone has a price. A ship, credits, a new identity. I can give you anything." Elias walked past him to the central command console. His fingers moved across the controls with the same practiced ease he had shown at the communication hub, pulling up files and databases and records that Rael had believed were encrypted beyond any intruder's ability to access. They were, but Elias had not broken the encryption. Yinri had given him the access codes 3 days ago, codes she had memorized over years of cleaning the rooms where careless officers left their terminals unlocked, code she had never had a reason to use until a human in a cage had given her one. The files opened. Transaction records going back decades. Names and dates and amounts. Every slave purchased, every creature acquired, every sentient being bought and sold and broken and killed for the entertainment of the wealthy and the powerful. Every buyer identified, every broker named, every credit transfer traced to its origin across a web of corruption that spanned half the galaxy. Elias opened a broadcast channel. Not the station's internal system this time, but the long-range array, the one that could reach every relay beacon in the sector and beyond, the one that could put a signal into the communication networks of 100 worlds simultaneously. He uploaded everything. Every file, every record, every name, every transaction. He broadcast it on an open channel with no encryption and no restrictions, and within seconds the data was propagating across the sector like a fire that could not be contained. Rael lunged from his seat, and Elias caught him by the throat without looking, holding the alien in place with one hand, while the other continued working the console. "You are destroying me," Rael hissed. "No," Elias said, and his voice was the same calm, steady tone it had been since the beginning. "I am letting the galaxy see what you are, and the galaxy will decide what to do with you." He released Rael, and the Syndicate Master stumbled back against his seat, and on the screens around the command center, the broadcast was already being picked up by news networks and law enforcement agencies, and the Galactic Council itself. Elias reached for one more control. A United Earth emergency distress beacon, military grade, encoded with his service number and rank, and a situation report that would bring every UE ship within range running at maximum speed. He activated it. Then he stepped back from the console and looked at Rael one final time. "You wanted an executioner," he said. He turned and walked out of the command center, and behind him, the most powerful man on the Velith expanse sat surrounded by the broken bodies of his guards and the exposed ruins of his empire, and understood for the first time in his life what it felt like to be the creature in the cage. The United Earth Battle Group arrived 9 hours later. 3 destroyers and a carrier dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that made the station's remaining defense systems look like toys. And within an hour the Velith expanse was secured, and the Syndicate's remaining forces had surrendered without firing a shot because they had seen the broadcast, and they knew that fighting would only add their names to a list that was already making its way to every courtroom in the galaxy. The freed prisoners were evacuated to the carrier's medical bay, over 300 beings from dozens of species who had been cataloged and processed and given blankets and food, and the simple dignity of being asked their names. Graves was among them. A UE medic was treating his hands, fitting prosthetic fingers that would work better than the originals, and when the medic asked him how he was feeling, Graves managed a broken smile that was the most beautiful thing he had produced in months. "Better," he said, and it was not a lie. Yinri found Elias in the last place she expected. He was sitting alone in the arena. The pit was empty now, the seats dark and the sand still churned from the Velthari fight, and the red emergency lights had been replaced by the steady white glow of the UE military's portable floodlights. He was sitting cross-legged on the sand where he had subdued the animal hours ago, and he was staring at his hands. Yinri walked across the sand, and her small taloned feet left tracks beside the much larger tracks of humans and aliens, and the deep gouges where the Velthari had charged. She stopped beside him and tilted her feathered head. "Are you all right?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "They thought eating meat made us monsters," he said finally, and his voice was tired in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones, tired in the place where a man keeps the things he has done and the things he has had to become. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had subdued a predator and disabled soldiers, and dismantled an empire in a single night. They were not entirely wrong, he said. He was quiet again, and Yinri waited, because she had learned that humans sometimes needed silence, the way other species needed sound. But monsters do not build schools, he said, and monsters do not write music, and monsters do not cry at funerals. He stood and looked down at her, and his eyes were wet but his voice was steady. We are something worse than monsters, he said. We are people who choose when to be monstrous, and people who choose when to stop. Yinri did not fully understand what he meant. But she reached up and took his hand, her small feathered fingers wrapping around his scarred and bloody ones, and he let her hold on and did not pull away. They walked out of the arena together, the human and the freed slave, through corridors that still smelled like smoke and fear, past walls scarred by energy fire and floors marked by the passage of creatures who would never be caged again. On the carrier's bridge, the UE captain reviewed the broadcast data and the security footage and the after-action reports, and then sat in silence for a very long time before filing the official record. Across the sector, the broadcast was still playing. Species who had only ever heard legends of humans watched the footage from the station's cameras and saw a creature that had been caged and studied and paraded and underestimated. And they saw what it did when it decided the cage was no longer acceptable. They saw it think. They saw it plan. They saw it endure and adapt and build alliances with beings it had never met and lead them to freedom with nothing but its voice and its will, and the terrifying patience of a species that had once chased its prey across entire continents without ever slowing down. The galaxy did not fear humans after that night. Fear was too simple a word for what they felt. They respected them, in the way that the ocean is respected, not because it is always violent but because it can be, and because it chooses its own tides. The incident was catalogued in the archived records of the Galactic Council under a single entry that would be studied and referenced, and quoted for centuries to come. Velith Expanse Incident Classification, First Contact Correction. And beneath the official text, someone had added a handwritten note in a script that no translator could identify, as if the author wanted to make sure the words carried the weight of personal experience rather than bureaucratic distance. Do not cage the humans. Do not provoke the humans. And above all, do not, under any circumstances, give them time to think.